Hi everyone, it's me again, Anne. How you going in these strange times that we seem to still be living in and will possibly continue to live in for a while longer at least? Well, we're going okay. Dan, Willem and I have all been working hard from home. Dan's been doing the lion's share of the homeschooling. As well as working for a client, and lucky enough to be working with me on a podcast that I'm doing for work. Willem's been doing remote school learning and finding creative ways to fill in his time that don't involve screens, like creating a very serious leaf collection and learning how to ride a skateboard, which is fun and slightly terrifying for me to watch. I'm continuing on in my two jobs, Voice at the Table and my community development job for NBC, which I love. I think during this time of stage 4 lockdown, for me, some of the hardest things are not having any alone time, but also having limited physical connections with the people I work with. So with both of these limitations, I'm finding my energy is quite depleted at times. But, on reflecting on this, I know that this is a really very luxurious problem to have. But I'm having to work hard to find some creative solutions. Thank God for the sunshine and for the local trees. It really does change the way my brain works, having all of these things. And I do also acknowledge that being in isolation is something that lots of people have to live with every day, in or out of lockdown. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. The Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations are the traditional custodians of the lands and waters of the land I'm speaking from now. And I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Having a few cafes within 500 metres of my house is something that I have taken for granted over for the past 20 years, but Dan and Willem and I certainly are not taking them for granted now. Cafes are our point of connection with the community. They give us purpose for our walks, and we know the cafe managers, and so it's also seeing acquaintances that we like every day. And at cafes, we're given the permission to stop and talk and to find out all the local news. And, going to one gives us the opportunity to bump into other people we know. So we're really, really fortunate. And thinking about how lucky we are that we have cafes that are in places where we are seen and known, helped me think about the text that I wanted to speak about today. So Brian's invitation was to talk about a biblical theme or principle that has impacted me. And the reason why I love going to the cafes is not just for my coffee fix, but also because in these places I feel included. And like I said before, they're places where I feel seen and I feel known and I feel understood. They're places that I have permission to go to and to connect with. And I'm really fortunate because I have the finances to do that. And I can also walk there, and these places are accessible for me because I'm able-bodied. So I know that I have great privilege in being able to access these places. The biblical theme, I think that's impacted me, that goes beyond social justice and ecological justice, is inclusion. When we look carefully at our ancient life-breathing text, we can see the call to find creative ways to include. Sometimes this is uncomfortable and challenging, but it's also an invitation for us to enter into wholeness and into flourishing. So what have been the life-changing moments of my life? Now this is relevant, I promise. So when I was 19, I started going to St Hilary's Anglican Church, the Shack, as it's known, in Kew. And some of my friends, Pete and Scott, who I knew from the Reformed Church in Geelong, had moved to Melbourne as well, and they'd started going there. And also this great new friend of mine, Meg, went there too. I'd met her the summer before in Port Campbell at Scripture Union Family Mission, or SUFM, and she was on the team, and we always went there camping every year, just like the rest of the Cobden Township, with the little town I grew up in. We'd all pack our stuff and off we'd go down to Port Campbell. Anyway, Meg was really cool and I was so excited she wanted to be my friend. And she introduced me to the Pixies album Doolittle, which is still a favourite of mine. I thought it was the coolest thing I had ever listened to. Anyway, Pete and Scott ended up being friends of Meg's. Wonderful! And they'd all started going to a social justice small group led by Steve Bradbury of the Tier fame that St Hilary's was hosted, and so I decided that I would go along too. I remember one of the first times that I went to that small group, we all sat around and we read Mark from start to finish one night, and what emerged amazed me. Here in this reading from Mark from start to finish, I encountered a Jesus I had never encountered before in all of my years of going to church. And I not only encountered Jesus, but I also encountered the people of these stories who I had never seen like this before either. What I saw was Jesus cared about what was happening in his country, and the fact that the Romans were a superpower, and there were people who were really poor and unclean who Jesus should never have touched, who Jesus touched. And the disciples were a group of really motley and flawed individuals. Jesus elevated women to the same status as men. Jesus challenged the political and religious systems of the time. And there was something called social justice. This was all so revolutionary for me. So this was not to be the last time I sat with a group of young adults and read Mark all the way through. I'm really, really thankful for these opportunities in me not only growing into adulthood, but growing into an understanding of the Bible that still impacts the way I think about the world today. And each time I sat down and I read Mark all the way through with a group of different people, I emerged with new understandings and insights that the group had divined from the text. I haven't done it in a lot of years, and I would be really interested in doing it again to see the new things that would emerge. So there's a passage that's become a central text to my learning as a Christian. It's not unusual for the Bible. It's a fantastic story about the power of what Jesus did in the communities. Remembering, the thing that I know now is that healing wasn't that unusual. For us, it's the healing stories that we go, wow! But the healing of the sick seemed to happen quite a lot during those times, and there are lots of people who are known to be healers. But what Jesus does is something that is radical and different. And it's radical, unfortunately, in our world today. So I'm going to read, if you want to get your Bibles, it's Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. And I'm reading, as I always do, from the Inclusive Bible, starting from chapter 21. When Jesus had crossed again to the other shore in the boat, a large crowd gathered, and he stayed by the lakeside. Then one of the synagogue officials, Jairus by name, came up and, seeing Jesus, fell down and pleaded earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is desperately sick. Come and lay your hands on her to make her better and save her life." Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed, pressing from all sides. Now there was a woman who had suffered from hemorrhages for 12 years. And after long and painful treatment from various doctors, she had spent all she had without getting better. In fact, she was getting worse. She had heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. "If I can touch even the hem," she had told herself, "I will be well again." Immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately, aware that the healing power had gone out from him, Jesus turned to the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" The disciples said, "You see how the crowd is pressing you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus continued to look around to see who had done it. Then the woman came forward, frightened and trembling, because she knew what had happened to her, and she fell at Jesus' feet and told him the whole truth. "My daughter," Jesus said, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be free of your affliction." While Jesus was still speaking, some people arrived from the house of the synagogue official to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why put the teacher to any further trouble?" But Jesus overheard the remark and said to the official, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Jesus allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James's brother John. They came to the official's house, and Jesus noticed all the commotion, with people weeping and wailing unrestrainedly. Jesus went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and crying? The child is not dead, but asleep." At this they began to ridicule him, and he told everyone to leave. Jesus took the child's mother and father and his own companions and entered the room where the child lay. Taking her hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." Immediately the girl, who was 12 years old, got up and began to walk about. At this they were overcome with astonishment. Jesus gave the family strict orders not to let anyone know about it, and told them to give the little girl something to eat. So, let me show you some of what I saw. I'm going to heavily use chapter 7 in Say to This Mountain, and the chapter 7 is written by one of the women authors. I don't know which one of the women authors it is who wrote this, because it doesn't credit her in the book, but it's pretty clear that it's one of the women who wrote this. All right, so let's get into the story. So the context is that Jesus had been to the other side of the lake, and now he was back in Jewish territory. And the first character we meet is the crowd. And the crowd operates like a character in the story. They're important. While Jesus is there talking, he's approached by a synagogue leader named Jairus, who throws himself down in front of Jesus. Now, Jairus is an important character. He's a synagogue leader, and he's so important in this story that he is named. So we know he is important, he has a name, and he's a leader. And he has every right to go up and present himself to Jesus and to speak to Jesus directly. He's a man and so can approach Jesus directly. He's a synagogue leader. In that culture, he's allowed to approach Jesus directly. What he does is request Jesus to come with him to heal his daughter, who's at the brink of death. This is a big part in the story. It's emotional, immediate, it's an immediate. Jesus leaves with him. But on the way, the crowd hem Jesus in. So the crowd stop Jesus really in his tracks. Here we're introduced to another character. A woman so unimportant to the crowd that she is nameless. Not only is she nameless, she's unclean. She hasn't been unclean for a little while, but she has been unclean for 12 years. And because she's been bleeding, it means that she needs to be quarantined and should not be out in public. This is a woman who can't participate in her Jewish faith rituals. This is a woman who can't be part of her community. This is a woman who can't go to the synagogue. And because she is a woman, she certainly shouldn't be approaching a rabbi. She is on the margins. She is other. She's spent all her money on doctors and suffered so much. She can't walk straight up to Jesus in the same way as Jairus. In fact, she creeps through the crowd and reaches out anonymously from behind. Jairus can approach Jesus face to face. The woman creeps behind and seeks to be anonymous. I think Mark presents these two opposite characters really, really clearly. And what happens next are miracles, which aren't just about the woman's healing. So we see Jesus calling out to the person who he healed. And the woman, after a while, emerges trembling from the margins of the story and into center stage, which is the place that Jairus felt entitled to be. This is now where she is. A woman that everyone would know is unclean. Someone who isn't allowed to participate. Yet she dared to come in and touch Jesus, and Jesus called on her, and he doesn't send her out, and he doesn't feel appalled by the fact that he's been touched by someone unclean. What he does is really profound. Jesus commends her faith and restores her to her rightful place as daughter in the family of Israel. In the family of Israel is where she can belong again now and be part of the community. This is miraculous work. But as Jesus is speaking to the woman, we hear that Jairus' daughter has died. It all happens at the same time. And at this point, Jesus instructs Jairus to believe. What? He's instructing a leader of the synagogue to learn about faith from this outcast woman. This is outstanding. This is so radical. This is transformational stuff. And we go to the end of the story, and all is well, and Jesus heals Jairus' 12-year-old daughter. So where the daughter had been living in prosperity for 12 years at the center of Jewish life, the woman has suffered terribly for 12 years, ejected from being part of Jewish life. I think this message in this text is profound, and it shows us a story where only when the woman is restored to true daughterhood can the daughter of the synagogue be restored to true life. I use a saying that I picked up from someone about 10 years ago, and I wish I could remember where I heard it first, because I'd love to say thank you. This story holds up this saying, as does our ancient text, all the way through, and that is, our well-being is tied up with the well-being of others. We can't be truly well if others are sick. We cannot be liberated if there are people imprisoned. There's a book that I've referenced before, and I still probably will for a really long time. It's a book, it's called Sand Talk. And the concept from our ancient text of our well-being is tied up with the well-being of others is embedded in our text, but also in the ancient beliefs of First Peoples. So Sand Talk's written by Tyson Yunkaporta, and really, his book has been one of those books that has changed my life because it's changed my thinking. All First Peoples, from all countries that make up what we now call Australia, believe inherently in the connection of all things. Not just people, but also the land and the waters and the rocks and everything that lives in and on the land and around it and the skies and everything. Everything that is part of creation is all connected. And the really interesting thing that I learned from this book and a few other books that I've been reading lately is that many of these mobs had disciplinary systems that didn't eject people, didn't exclude and exile people, but actually restored the person who did the wrong back into the mob. So people were brought back in because their well-being was tied up with others. I wonder whether, when Jesus talks about the last will be first, whether that's not the image of who gets into heaven first, but whether it's an instruction for us to bring those people into the center who have been pushed out. The last, those who are considered the last, those who are considered the least, they're not the last and they're not the least. They have just been considered to be those things. Whether when those people can come and have a voice and have agency in our world and in our societies and for themselves and for those around them, with those around them, that this is what brings us wholeness and flourishing. This text talks about Jesus healing the bleeding woman first, before he goes to heal Jairus' daughter. There's a suggestion that, like I said before, that Jairus' daughter could not be healed unless the bleeding woman who had gone through so much atrocities at the hands of physicians and also the purity elements of her own culture, whether the healing of those things and the restoration of people who have been pushed out need to happen before those at the center can be healed. And I wonder whether it's not just people who need to be restored and healed, but also the rest of our world, the environment, the animals and creatures that live on the land, how much damage we're doing to ourselves because we don't respect and we think that our environment is an other, something that we can just use and abuse and not regard. I think this story is really significant for me because it reminds me again that I can't close my eyes to what is happening to the people around me. And I can't close my eyes to what is happening to the environment. And I can't close my eyes about what's happening to the flora and fauna in our world. I can't close my eyes to that because if they're not doing well, Jesus reminds us that us as individuals can't be doing well. How can we be well when there are people who are struggling incredibly because of systems in our society that keep them out? How can I be doing well when I hear stories about people who have been institutionalized and diminished and not given any voice or any agency? How can I go about living my life believing that I'm well when there are people in our society, when there are asylum seekers who have no rights, where there are people who are struggling to stay here who might be deported for no other reason other than that they are not white? How can I be happy in myself and the world I'm living in when First Peoples, their rights and their voices and their solutions are not being listened to by our government? I can shut my eyes to those things because sometimes they feel really hard. And I've confessed before that there are movies that I haven't been able to watch, true movies about Australian history. And before I've been challenged by God to look at those things and to be moved by those things and to be made uncomfortable by those things, because that moves me into action. And it's not just me moving as an individual into action. I love Sandtalk because it says that it talks about that there is no word for me as a isolated individual in First Peoples languages. It's all me, you, I, we. Me in the context of being daughter, of being mother. All of these words are about us not being in isolation. So where does the woman's story become your story? When have you been the excluded one? When have you been the invisible one? When have you been quarantined? Maybe, just like the woman, you dared to reach out and receive the healing power of the Spirit in one way or another. And you did this when you didn't feel worthy. When was that? And who and what is the bleeding woman in our communities today? Jesus prioritizes these people who are pushed to the margins. And what he does is not just leave them there and not just go there and go, oh, you poor things. What he does is he allows them, he removes the barriers for them to then come in and participate. I really think that Jesus asks us to do this. Maybe if we're to put the last first, we need to understand the social diseases that marginalised people experience and become allies and advocate for those systems to change so that our world is equitable. And maybe if we're to put the last first, we need to really engage with how we treat our environment, especially after this year and the awful fires that ravaged our land. Maybe we need to work towards an equitable world where no person is seen as greater than another. And this allows us to share in Jesus' healing mission, which brings about flourishing communities where people can thrive and where we can see each other and where we can know each other and live life to our full. It's a bit of a tough call, especially when we're also isolated and feeling the pressure of being alone, which shows us again that we're created to be people who live in communities. And I really believe that we have the solutions to together to help our communities heal. And I think that's a really daunting but a really exciting journey that we can all be in together. Holy God, thank you for these. Thank you for your ancient word that's not just ancient but breathes life from past to present and into future. Thank you that we can look at these texts, we can hear your word and feel your Spirit move in us to change the world so that it is a place of healing and rejuvenation and restoration. But I just ask you, God, to give us the courage to do that and to give us the strength to do that, but also that we never have to feel like we're doing this alone, because you've provided us with a community of people who love and care about each other in the world. Give us the grace to not judge others. Give us the grace to be able to ask questions and to sit with empathy for others. Give us the grace to be kind to ourselves, to not judge ourselves, but that we can enter into the forgiveness that you offer so we can take the next step further into life and living. Amen.